Or we can get started now. So welcome everyone. My name is Marcel and welcome to our sports diplomacy webinar series titled Beyond the Game. It's good to see, I'm just looking at some of the participants. It's good to see some previous UNITAR participants and trainers, Elizabeth Colton and Luana Rodriguez. Good to see you here. So essentially, what we're going to be talking about today is a new and kind of exciting field. And we're very lucky to have one of the main kind of speakers or experts in the field with us today, and that's Dr. Simon Rofe. And before I hand over to him for his webinar in which he'll be discussing how we can leverage mega sporting events to strengthen multilateralism, I'll just walk you all through the structure of today's webinar and then talk a little bit about the UN, UNITAR, and what looking at sports diplomacy a little broadly. So first of all, we'll just talk about UNITAR. So UNITAR is essentially the dedicated training arm of the United Nations, and its mission and purpose is to help enhance the effectiveness of the United Nations. And that includes both the system and also the member states. And the way we do this is through dedicated capacity building and training initiatives, as well as research. So UNITAR essentially was founded or created in the early 60s during this wave of decolonization that was happening at the time. And this was essentially to respond to a demand for diplomatic training. Many of these states found themselves without the capacity to negotiate and to, they found themselves having to enter this very complex system that is the United Nations. And they didn't necessarily have the tools to negotiate to the same level as other states had. And so UNITAR emerged. And today, our mandate has changed a little bit. We're still, delivering on that base mandate of diplomatic training, but we're also providing training and learning solutions to individuals, organizations, and also, the private sector, non-governmental organizations as such. And the division which I represent today and which is leading many of these efforts in the field of sports diplomacy is the Division for Multilateral Diplomacy. This is a cross-cutting division within the Institute, and the goal of our division is to strengthen multilateralism and the UN system by implementing training focused on addressing the needs of diplomats and international civil servants as such. And we focus predominantly on skill development and capacity building. Now, if we can have the next slide, please, Michael, and the slide after that. So if we look at sports diplomacy in general, sorry, one more slide, please, Michael. In general, sports diplomacy and sports as a whole is a billion-dollar industry, and it has this kind of important effect on people all around the world. It has this unique power to bring people together, and this is through either a love of shared physical pursuits, but it can also be for some of the main reasons why sport is appreciated by people around the world, which is this way in which it reflects life. I think we can all see that in everyone has played sport to some degree in their lives, and there are certain traits that we can take from sport that apply to everyday life. Things like leadership. Who's the captain of the football team? Hard work. How do you improve your your forehand? And perseverance, communication. Even SDG number 5. Gender equality. There's lots to be learned from sport and to be applied to life and diplomacy as a whole. And looking at diplomacy, we see examples of this every day. And in particular at these kind of mega events. Today we're kicking off the Paris Olympics. And if we look back at previous Olympic Games, we've seen North and South Korea marching under a united Korean flag in the 2018 Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang. So we see this kind of rapidly changing world, and we see divisions and as such happening. And sports diplomacy, for me at least, and for us all here today, the reason why we join these webinars is to understand this better, and it can be this kind of beacon of light in a way. So looking at sports diplomacy in the UN very quickly before I hand over to Simon, there is the International Day of Sport for Development and Peace, essentially designed to promote the promotion of peace and inclusive societies and recognize the positive role that sport can play, not just in physical activity, but also in impacting people's lives across the globe. Linked to this, if we have the next slide, we have UNESCO has a number of initiatives in this field. For example, the Fit for Life kind of initiative, essentially designed to support integrated policy making and enhance the well-being of youth around the world. And then we also have another UNESCO program, which is the Change the Game campaign, which is essentially the selection of programs and forums that advance principles of equality, dignity, and dialogue in and through sport. Again, this can all be seen to being linked back to the Sustainable Development Goals in the form of the Partnership for the Goals, of course, SDG number 17. Now, right before I hand over to Simon, I just like to introduce him a little bit. Now, Simon is a world-leading expert when it comes to sports diplomacy, one of the founders of the field. And he's essentially a reader and associate professor of international politics at the University of Leeds. However, he has also held many other academic roles across Europe, including in the UK, Switzerland, Croatia, and Spain, and always related to law and sports diplomacy. He's a member of UNESCO's Intergovernmental Committee for Physical Education and Sport, and also a lead editor when it comes to the comprehensive handbook that he published of sports diplomacy. Now, thank you all for listening. I'll be back after Simon's webinar, after Simon's lecture, to talk a little bit more about UNITAR and some of the activities that we can offer in this field, should you be interested in some either customized training or some general programs on sport and diplomacy. But without further ado, I hand the floor to Simon. Thank you all. And yeah, thank you, Simon.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Marcel, for that very generous introduction. If we might have the next slide, please. So, my sort of twin thoughts for today. I have a guiding question for us to keep us largely on track, or at least me, over the course of the next maybe half an hour, in which I will share some further thoughts on how sport diplomacy addresses the prospect of multilateral reconciliation and peace. So to do that, I'm going to start with a little piece around the sort of broad concept of international relations and multilateralism, and then look at our understanding of sport diplomacy sort of through two approaches. One is around concepts and second around practice. And within that, I'd like us to think about, on this very auspicious day of sport diplomacy, the opening of a Summer Olympic Games, to think about how the sporting event is a fulcrum of sports diplomacy, perhaps the pinnacle of our endeavours. Given that this is a Friday afternoon conversation, especially, I'd very much welcome your questions. So please feel free to utilise the chat, and Michael will pull them together, and we can use that as the basis for a Q&A session towards the end. Next slide, please. So as I say, it's an auspicious day. The Paris 2024 Olympic Games will begin in a matter of hours. Another reason why I will not speak for too long is we can all look forward to getting into a comfy position, perhaps with a glass of something, to enjoy this, what will be fascinating opening ceremony, unique in a number of ways, and will create many, many column inches, or indeed blog pages, worth of comment in the morning. Next slide, please. But let me take you back a little, 12 years, to another opening ceremony at the London Stadium at the beginning of the London 2012 Games. I will confess to having played a absolutely tiny role in the London Olympic Games as part of the International Relations Department, where I didn't get to make any groundbreaking decisions. I didn't get to shape, as it were, the outcome of competition or the diplomacy that took place. But what I did do is was able to observe how in those 12 weeks that I was most intimately involved, how the realms of sport on the one hand and diplomacy interacted with each other. And where they interlocked and where they buffed up against each other, that was the fascinating, for me to study and to be part of in an ethnographic fashion. Next slide, please. But that's my memory. And I'd just like you to take a moment or two, just a few seconds, to think about what you understand by sport diplomacy, that guiding question, and task yourself with recalling your earliest Olympic memory. One that's perhaps unique to you, and just make a little note of it. Save it for later, and we'll come back to it. So if you just take a moment, what was the first Olympics you remember, and why? Maybe it was the performance of an athlete from your country. Maybe it was some particularly dramatic race, the outcome of a competition, the geopolitical situation. Maybe it recalls something that you went outside and tried with your brothers or sisters or in the street. Just give it some thought for a moment. Okay, with that to one side, next slide, please, Michael. Tiny bit of my appreciation. So here you see me adorning the volunteer uniform, which I wore on occasion during the 2012 Olympics outside Buckingham Palace on the final day of the Olympics. And I had the privilege of being inside a number of stadia and observing, being party to all sorts of different experiences from that vantage point. But two really stand out. Next slide, please. And they reflect something about the nature of international relations and multilateralism, which we'll come to. In the image on the left-hand side, you see the silhouette of a gentleman by the name of Greg Hartung. Now, it may be that some of you are familiar with him, but I might be surprised if you were. That's not because he wasn't a wonderfully intelligent, thoughtful, kind gentleman, but because he was someone who operated as an agent of international relations, somewhat as he is here, in the shadows of others. Not because he wasn't able in any way, but because there is a whole cast of characters, individuals working in different environments who make sporting events happen and facilitate sports diplomacy. And Greg, who at this point held the position as vice chair of the International Paralympic Committee, was a really good example of someone who had huge amount of diplomatic acumen, brought about not by a particular training package. I'm sure he would have enjoyed and benefited from a UNITAR package had there been one available to him, but from his experience as a journalist over many years in different hemispheres, working with different organizations. And then his exposure to the Paralympic movement, particularly. So within his homeland of Australia, then within Oceania as a regional body, and then within the global body that is the International Paralympic Committee. So that individual, amongst many others, had agency. On the other hand, you will recognize in the badly taken picture by my own hand, 4 flags in the center of that picture. One is the International Paralympic Committee. One is the United Nations flag. One is the the LOCOG committee flag, the one with the sort of pink emblem on. And the other is the Union Jack, the host nation. Now, my contention, and this is where the structures of international relations come into play, that are manifest in a sporting event, particularly an Olympic and Paralympic Games, is that only through sport do those 4 entities, those 4 structures come together. A body set up after the Second World War to rehabilitate soldiers, particularly based in the United Kingdom to start with. The United Nations, the world's preeminent state-based governmental organization. LOCOG, an organization, a project management body that ceased to be in law on September the 10th, 2012. And the Union Jack, which, if you'll forgive me a parochial moment as a UK citizen, already represents 4 different flags in that being England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So in this area, you see the structures of nation states, of organizations, of intergovernmental organizations, and of particular specialized agencies. Next slide, please. That said, you should be wary of definitions from academics, because we have been known as an industry, as a sector, to propagate certain points of view based on our own perspectives. And that I would ask you to be suitably critical of. Next section, next slide. That said, some definitions, or at least some understandings of international relations and multilateralism. So the academic field of international relations, that comes with the big I and the big R, is a relatively recent phenomenon. It's only 106 years old, if you wanted to put the end of the First World War as its foundation. Now, relations between international bodies, those relationships, perhaps the small r and the small I, had clearly been going on for many decades in terms of nation states. But international relations, I would argue, and have done in various of my sort of scholarly outputs, was not born with the Treaty of Westphalia, that piece of sort of happenstance Central European organization that put things into bodies that we now recognize as states, whether city-states or nation-states. Now, the nation-state's success has been remarkable over the last 400 years, but it doesn't mean it was here forever, and it doesn't mean it will be there forever and a day. But it is the essential building block. And when we think of international relations in common parlance, even amongst scholars who spend a lot of time talking about it, we tend to focus in the first instance on this kind of image of flags, of national emblems. Now, all of these flags carry values and have different resonances with different citizens, whether positive or negative. But there's a certain conformity to them. They're all the same size. They're all on the same size flagpoles. They recognize each other's color palette, if nothing else. So this tells us something about the way that states behave. They have a degree of equality between them, however rich or poor, however big or small. And this means that we have means for sort of multilateral conversations in different ways. So multilateral very simply means that we have more than one party. Unilateral being the action of one entity, bilateral two, and multilateral more than two. And so multilateralism, and what we look at when we see these flags, is not only what we could see outside the UN General Assembly every September, but at what we might see adorning various boats along the Seine this afternoon and evening, is a version of this. And therefore that interconnection of realms, the way that sport and diplomacy talk to each other, that's the fascinating function of this discussion. Hopefully sets us up for questions and the further seminars that Marcel and his colleagues have organised. Next slide, please. Another example, sport diplomacy in terms of concept and practice. Now, we will be seeing Mr. Back, who makes a performance with a nice warm jacket on the 2018 opening ceremony for the Pyeongchang Olympic, Winter Olympic and Paralympic Games. And we also see President Macron celebrating the third goal, I think it was, in the 2018 World Cup final that France won against Croatia in Russia. Now, there's much that could be said about both of these images, but what they tell us in short order is that important people are attending these events, and sport has a huge convening power because of it. The consequence of those actions to others, in some senses, is in the eye of the beholder. So the French football fans who were in the stadium were probably far more interested in celebrating Paul Pogba's goal than they were worried about what their president was doing. To those who were preparing to compete at the Winter Olympics, on behalf of their country and having spent many, many hours preparing to be the world's best ice skater or skier, the fact that there was a North Korean diplomat in the opening ceremony probably didn't concern them necessarily. But these are events that take place because of the sport that we can see, because of the dynamism of what sport can do to convene people together. Next slide, please. And here I'm just going to briefly reference those 3 core characteristics of diplomacy that I see transcending this. So communication, representation, and negotiation. More that could be said on that, but I just want to throw those out there for you. Next slide, please. Again, I won't dwell on this, simply to say that there's some very well esteemed authors and myself who have written on this subject. And again, you're welcome to dip into this as you see fit. Next slide, please. A little bit of a definition on my behalf, touching on the representation, negotiation, and communication, and making sure that we recognize the role of practitioners in this space. It's not the preserve of academics in ivory towers. It's making sure that policymakers and practitioners have time to reflect critically on their practice and enhance their opportunity to utilize sport for the cause of peace and reconciliation. Thank you. Next slide. So here I would just dwell a little on the practice and concept. So in terms of 4 dimensions of practice: sports governance, law and ethics, sustainability and accessibility, the important role of athletes themselves as diplomats in tracksuit, as my colleague Gavin Price has said. And then also just to really reflect on the fact that sport has a great convening power, whether that's the Olympic Games that's going to see millions of viewers tune in and hundreds of thousands of people alongside the same this evening, or at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning at a sports field near you where 15, 20, 7-year-olds may turn up for a game of cricket or a game of football or whatever else. The concept, words that one can attribute to Nelson Mandela: sport has the power to change the world. Equally, it is dynamic, dramatic, and emotional. It connects us. And because of that, it allows for what Cardinal Richelieu called a négociation continuelle, the ongoing process of negotiation. It also carries messages, particularly soft power messages, that are distinct from other hard power, economic, or military concepts. And to quote my erstwhile boss from London 2012, that is Lord Sebastian Coe, himself twice an Olympic gold medalist, fundamentally, sport is the best diplomat we have. And I concur. Next slide, please. Again, I'm not going to dwell too much on these, but simply to say that sport is governed. Laws, ethics, values shape what happens in sport. And whether you play, administer, coach, there are, as Marcel alluded to, lessons that can be taken from other aspects of life that apply in sport and vice versa. Next slide, please. There is an important point here around equality, diversity, and inclusion. And the IOC, Mr. Bach, at the beginning of the year, talked to how these values are fundamental principles of Olympism. One can be possibly critical, certainly possibly cynical about this, but there are important aspects of how an organization like the IOC, but also at other levels of sport, whether that's at the Olympic Games or on the street in the park, where these matters come to bear. Again, more to be said on that, but in the interest of time, we'll move on. Next slide. Something that, again, we could spend a whole seminar talking about: sustainability and accessibility when it comes to major sporting events and the way we deal with that. One of the events of Paris 2024 will take place in Tahiti, which is many thousands of miles away from the French capital. That reflects the nature of France, its constitution, the way that territory is aligned to its values. They are perfectly within the realm of discussion, but again, thinking about how we look to environmental sustainability, sustainability of athletes' well-being, these are important considerations in terms of thinking about the touch points for multilateralism. Next slide, please. A question: can the Olympic and Paralympic Games be sustainable? We won't have time for an answer. I'm sure you have opinions. And again, we're welcoming of them. But I think this image at least gives us a foresight into some of the touch points here. Next slide, please. I don't think we should overlook the importance of athletes in this. For a long time, up until 1994, the athletes had no voice in the IOC. There was no athletes commission, as it's now known. One can be cynical about the athletes commission's influence, but the athletes have an important role. Whether they choose to use it to carry a political message or simply to make sure that they are financially rewarded, athletes will take their own decisions on that. But I don't think we should underestimate their significance, not least as the conduit to many of the audiences for sport. Next slide, please. As I say, to quote Mr. Mandela, sport has the power to change the world. Next slide, please. So sport has a great convening power. Approximately 10,000 people will be involved in the opening ceremony this evening. It is a grand operation. The scale of people who will be there is huge. There will be many shots in whatever coverage you see of panning to the audience, panning to the spectators. There will be numerous shots, I'm sure, of the hosts, but there will be other dignitaries, celebrities participating and being part of it. And they are there because of a sporting competition. Their interest in, with greatest respect to archery or volleyball, may be marginal, but the opportunity is there because there is a sporting competition. And there is something about sporting competition that engages a great number of our fellow citizens of the world. Next slide, please. A picture in the National Gallery in London, as it happens, of a French cardinal, in Cardinal Richelieu. And really here I want to set up the sort of tension between, on the one hand, your heart will race watching some of the sport in the next 2 weeks, or at least mine will. But on the other hand, diplomacy is a cold-hearted, realpolitik calculation that simply happens and is away from emotion. It's almost the apotheosis of emotion. And it's this tension that I think provides for a really interesting understanding of where diplomacy and sport interact. And it can provide some real moments of tension, as we'll come to. Next slide, please. So I really want to talk to this sort of soft power potential, the networks of sport diplomacy. This is how we can make connections between different parts of the world, between different communities, and sport as a conduit for that is really valuable. Next slide, please. And here we see Lord Coe in his sort of athletic best and of more recent vintage. I believe sport is the best diplomat we have. Next slide, please. So let us reflect for a moment. Think back to those values and those memories, perhaps, that you jotted down or sort of thought back to from your younger days. What does it mean to be able to utilize sport in that end? Next slide, please. And I'd asked us to apply our reflections to the Sustainable Development Goals. An example, particularly in the 17th, of multilateralism writ large in my mind. And an exercise I ask of my students, and I'll share it with you as a little challenge, we won't have a chance to fully flesh it out, is looking at the SDGs, however familiar you may be with them. Which of them apply most to sport? Where can sport make a difference? Maybe it's in addressing quality education, gender equality. Maybe it's in highlighting sustainable cities and communities and reducing inequalities. Wherever you see it lie, there are grounds for those views, I'm sure. From my point of view, I tend to lean towards the 17th, those partnerships. As a student of diplomacy, you might suspect that to be the sort of default answer. And in that sense, I'm happily compliant. Next slide, please. So as I draw my remarks to a close, what to take away from my thoughts today on this, as I say, most sport diplomacy of days, if you like. Next slide, please. So I do think there's a role for sport diplomacy in peace and reconciliation. The United States and the Republic of Iran do not have diplomatic relations, but they do have a common bond in wrestling. And it hasn't resolved the ongoing conflict, but it gives an opportunity for conversations that wouldn't happen otherwise. Next slide, please. And I see that in a number of other instances too. So this image from the 2018 opening ceremony, a North Korean and South Korean athlete. Now I know that because I know the antecedents of this picture. But what you see here is two Korean athletes and a Korean flag representing all of Korea in one body, in United Nations blue, as it happens. So the opportunity, is very much there. Now we know in the subsequent 6 years, there has not been a resolution to the tensions on the Korean Peninsula. There is no resolution to the armistice that was signed in 1953. But that Olympic moment, the Olympic diplomacy of Thomas Bach, gave us the opportunity. Next slide, please. So I see sport diplomacy as that network of networks and as the rationale for dialogue. And in that sense, I'm very much in line with what Mandela said in terms of sport having the power to change the world. And to that next slide, please, Michael. So I'd like us to think about your practice as a sport diplomat, whether that's supporting a team, whether that's attending an event, whether that's taking children, coaching, whatever it may be. How can you help do that? And how can you change the world, representing back to what Greg's influence, if you like, as an individual actor, to be able to demonstrate agency in that space. So thank you very much there. The final slide is just that you're very welcome to be in touch. Be happy to hear from you. And then to open this up for question and answer. Michael.
So thank you so much, Simon. It's been a real pleasure hearing from you and hearing all of these, looking from an academic perspective, getting all these insights into how sports and diplomacy are related, how it can be used to support multilateralism. And it's funny, as you talk, you just can't help but think of examples here and there. You mentioned diplomats in tracksuits, and all I can think about is Kylian Mbappe, speaking almost perfect Spanish already in anticipation of his move to Real Madrid. And it's just another fantastic opportunity to understand different cultures, bridge different gaps between states and such. And it's really a beautiful thing. So thank you all, everyone. Again, thank you, Simon. Thank you, Michael. And please join us in our next webinars. Have a lovely day, evening, wherever you're based. And we look forward to welcoming you to Geneva in the near future.